Welcome to this new episode, and today I am in the company of Gemini, who is a trauma specialist in Koh Phangan. How are you, Gemini?
I'm doing great, thank you.
I am in your beautiful center, which you are developing right now and getting ready to launch. And I like to learn a little bit more about your background. So I know that you are specialized in trauma, but how did you end up sort of designing and then building this beautiful center?
Well, it's a long story, so I'll try to be brief. Essentially, like many of us, I grew up in a pretty dysfunctional home, and there was a lot of trauma taking place in the environment. And in addition to that, I experienced a lot of bullying at school. And then my mum died when I was 21. So my first sort of 20 years, I feel like there was this accumulation of things that had taken place, but I tried some traditional talk therapy and other things, and it didn't really seem to have an impact on the things that I was struggling with that were a consequence of this unresolved trauma. And also I grew up in England, you know, stiff upper lip, people don't talk about things. And so I made my way to California in my early 30s and spent 10 years living there, and was very intrigued and seeking something, like many of us. I was seeking something, and you know, I entered into the yoga community and the spiritual communities. But it was really when I came into contact with somatic therapies, which means of the body, so body-based therapy, that I started to find resolution for the symptoms that I was struggling with, which included anxieties, depression, some substance abuse, you know, issues sort of what I call adulting, and really came to the understanding that I was experiencing CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay.
And this is a little bit different to PTSD, which is a term people are more familiar with.
For sure.
PTSD tends to happen as a consequence of a sort of very impactful event that can happen once, but it can happen several times. So, for example, we tend to link PTSD with
War.
military, people who've gone into a battlefield. But many of us grew up in battlefields, right?
Indeed.
And so, you know, if you're deployed for 3 months into a war zone, then of course that's going to have an impact on you, but it is short-lived. But some people spend, you know, the first 10, 15 years of their life living in a battle zone. And so the other important component is that, you know, we learn from our parents. So if our parents are traumatized themselves by their own upbringings, and they don't have the skills to help educate us in sort of healthy expression of anger, or how to identify our needs, or how to even recognize we have needs, because perhaps we're, you know, in a home where there's a narcissistic parent who everybody's needs are put to the side because it's all about their needs. And so CPTSD is really this more complex form of trauma resolution, and it really does require a different kind of treatment. And so along the way, I was really seeking resources and tools for my own healing, and from my early 20s began training too, initially as a yoga teacher, and then with the National Federation of Spiritual Healers, working with sort of energy healing. And then I started to take it into more of those traditional forms, so with the Center for Justice Resource Institute in Boston, and TRE, Trauma Release Exercises with Dr. David Pacelli, and somatic trauma resolution with a lady called Sharon Porter, who was one of Peter Levine's first ever students. And so as I sort of evolved in my own journey, I acquired school tools and skills and certifications along the way, and really I think from my own experience started to see what really worked and what didn't work, and so building this kind of comprehensive understanding of how much we need an integrated approach to work with genuinely healing trauma. And so over the last 25 years of my life, that has turned into my profession.
Indeed, indeed. It seems you have a very long experience working with people and helping them overcome trauma and find ways to live a better life. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, Koh Phangan certainly is a place where people come because they're seeking healing, they're seeking personal development. So, and there is no dedicated trauma center in Koh Phangan as yet, obviously. So I think everybody is looking forward for you to start on these new projects, which is very exciting. I'd like to ask you, amongst the different therapies, you say that there are different modalities that can be applied in a holistic way to help people. And I think you like to apply more than one modality at the same time, right? Of course, the underlying theme here is the body, the embodiment. Mm-hmm. So what is your strongest therapy that you really love and you like to talk about more in details?
Tricky. And it's tricky because particularly treating this kind of trauma, so complex trauma, really does require a combination of therapies. Mm-hmm. There is no single one that is going to just be the miracle answer, and that's a problem because most people are looking for the miracle answer. Mm-hmm. But essentially what happens, particularly when we experience trauma in childhood, is that we become fragmented. So it's like we get split into lots of parts. So rather than this kind of one whole psyche and being, and that fragmentation causes a lot of problems. And so the combination of learning what dissociation is, which is how most of us learn to cope with our traumatic experiences. Mm-hmm. And when we dissociate, we come out of our bodies, essentially. And so learning to help people recognize when they're dissociating and come back into their bodies is essential. So a lot of people, the term embodiment flies around, but most people have no clue what that really means from an embodied perspective because they've never experienced it. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the first and foremost keys. And then in addition to that is really working with these fragmented parts. So essentially, you may have a part of you that is still 5 years old and hiding under the bed because your parents were screaming at each other. So it's being able to work with those often terrified parts and bring them back into the conversation. The term we use is that they're exiled. They're kind of working on the edges of us. But those are the parts that come back in when we're triggered by things in life and actually hijack. They take over the present grounded adult self, and suddenly we sort of get lost, and this young part comes in and starts running the show. So the combination of that ability to come back into your body and actually to start to come into dialogue with these fragmented or frozen or terrified parts and bring them out so that they can be heard and seen, because often they have never been heard or seen. Sure. And just developing that dialogue between you and the therapist and you and those parts is one of the most foundational elements in really bringing resolution to childhood trauma.
Okay, so if I am a client of your center and I'm coming in one day and I say, I feel terrible, I've been depressed for like 6 months or longer, my life has always been very challenging for me. Yeah. What is the first step?
So we do an intake where we ask you a lot of questions, and in that you get to share some of your personal trauma history. And even that can be re-traumatizing, because when you actually start to write down all the experiences you've had that you feel were traumatic in some way, for some people there's a long list, and just actually seeing them all written out can suddenly provide a sense of overwhelm, like, oh my God, is there any hope for me? Right? Sure. But that's important for us to understand what we're working with. We also ask questions about your relationship to your emotions, relationship to anger, relationship to intimacy and sexuality, use of substances, to understand really how you're coping with what is happening in your physiology. So for most of us who had trauma at some point in our lives, it impacts our physiology, which means our ability to basically stay grounded and present inside our system, and whether we're then living life from a place of like relaxed social engagement, feeling very present, able to healthily connect with others, or are we caught in the fight-flight response where we're either sort of constantly angry or feeling triggered, or we're just running away from things, or we might be really dissociated and just frozen. And so that's the most important aspect for us, is to really assess where you're at and what you're struggling with the most.
Sure.
And then we can begin to make an internal assessment as to how we're going to treat that individual. And another key component is that we're not just looking at trauma from the perspective of what's happened to you as an individual. And I think this is perhaps where we differentiate with a lot of other organisations, which is that from my own experience, and I've also worked with a number of different indigenous communities and shamanic practices and teachers from around the planet. And in those traditional cultures, they understood that what has happened to our ancestors also impacts us as individuals. And so we also look at the history of what might have happened to your own parents, and then recognizing that oftentimes the traumas that have been unresolved for them are, you're kind of carrying them in some way. And so a lot of what we can be experiencing in terms of symptoms, which could be anything from, you know, problems in relationships to substance abuse to financial woes, an inability to really sort of ground and live somewhere, can all be not really from our own traumas, but from the traumas that were experienced by our direct relatives or our ancestors. So we really work with this whole person model. So we will also inquire around those areas to look to see whether or not we need to bring in treatments too, such as family constellation work.
Oh, yes.
Or shamanic practices where we can work with ancestral healing as well.
Sounds lovely, sounds great. I really like the fact that you have so many different tools, therapies and modalities that you can sort of play around with depending on the individual coming in. And what would you recommend an individual to stick around in Koh Phangan in order to have a meaningful experience in your center? What would be the minimum?
Sure, well, you know, some people come and they're just only here for a week, and, you know, we'll work with what I call triage, which is what can we do right now to bring some sense of relief or some sense of understanding as to what is happening for that individual. And there are people that, you know, we've worked with where it's just a one-off encounter, but to really begin to correct the patterns in a way that's going to provide consistency and real resolution, somewhere between 1 and 3 months worth of treatment, which is at least one weekly session. And then maybe in addition to that, support with some other therapies, and that may be deeper body-based work, which could be TRE or cranial sacral therapy or osteopathy, because, you know, over time, the trauma starts to impact our physical body, right? It literally sort of takes residue into the cellular structure and the fascia and the muscles, and, you know, we hold a lot of tension. But yeah, the majority of my clients I work with, my clients individually, sort of 1 to 3 months. Sometimes 6. It really depends on the individual's conditions. So yeah, a reasonable amount of time. But we're not, you know, trying to sign people up to sort of 10 years of psychotherapy. My focus really is always on what's the most effective way to treat, and how can we ensure that we're giving tools to the individual so that this isn't just a sort of therapeutic relationship where they have to keep coming back to us. They've really got skills and tools to work with so that they can be really engaged in their own transformation. That's really important. So that they can also then carry those skills into their individual families to work with their own children or their partners or whoever it may be too. And we also work with couples and family members as well. So sometimes we're seeing sort of a brother and sister together, or parents, and sometimes parents with the children too.
I'd like to ask you, what kind of people would you like to work with ideally? If somebody is very acutely stressed out, like again, somebody from a war zone, for instance, would you work with them as well, or you're looking to work primarily with people that have trauma, recognize unhealthy patterns in their lives, and they're already kind of like dealing with them in a positive way? Yeah.
So a lot of times when people are in acute trauma response, they have, you know, severe mental health problems, emotional health problems. They may have very severe addiction, and that requires a special kind of very deep treatment, and often residential treatment, because you know, a big part of it is supporting people through the sort of breakdown period that happens when you let go of your crutches, and we don't yet have the capability to do that here. So at the moment, you know, obviously we're starting with a small centre and planting some seeds. Working with people who have some baseline, a foundation, and as you rightly pointed out, recognise that there's some patterns that are not serving them. Perhaps they haven't even identified yet the source of what is going on in them. A lot of people come and don't yet recognise that what happened in their homes was actually trauma. That's pretty common. And they're normalising their experiences, like, oh, you know, my trauma, it wasn't really that bad, other people had it worse than me. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because it's what happened to your nervous system and how it impacted your psyche and your physiology that's important, not how big or small that was in comparison to someone else's. And so, yeah, definitely people that have, a solid foundation. That doesn't mean that we don't have the capacity to refer out to other resources, and we do that all the time. We sort of work with a particular piece, and then I can see, okay, actually this would be really helpful for them now, so we'll refer to other organisations, other individuals, and we're also looking at ways that we can support the community here when people do have perhaps a mental break, or psychological breakdown, or they've experienced sexual assault, or some of the things that do obviously and unfortunately occur within our community, but we don't necessarily directly have the full resources, but we can help support people in guiding them to where to go.
Makes sense. I know that there is another resort here that has a plan to become an addiction center.
Yeah.
And so that would be very interesting to have also that element on the island.
Absolutely. And if you look at what's actually going on in the world right now and the level of trauma that is taking place.
Even 2020.
Day by day.
2020 was terrible, I think, for anxiety, depression, mental health. I mean, I think the media is not really reporting it fully yet, but over the next few months or years, we'll really see the full extent
of it. And, in essence, we're in a gigantic social experiment right now. And even, kids being removed from school, homeschooled, but essentially banned from seeing their friends. We don't even know what the impact of that will be in years to come. Sure. Sadly, I've already seen and witnessed children of some friends who've actually committed suicide. And so it's not just the impact on the adults, it's the impact on the next generations. And then obviously people, losing their livelihoods, their whole business is being threatened, but then the disconnect of actually not being able to be in human connection. So I think the need for mental health services and trauma treatment is only going to sadly continue to expand as a consequence, particularly of what's been happening to us on a global scale in the last 18 months or so.
I totally agree indeed. Well, Gemini, thank you very much for having having this nice time with me today, just chatting about your new center coming up. I think you're going to be launching it very soon, within a few months now, because I had a bit of a tour of the property. It's very pretty, very nicely decorated, and with all the final touches almost there, so it's certainly ready to be started, yeah?
Yeah, it's just waiting on the Thai legal system and the parameters of what is a consequence of the lockdown. So fingers crossed, Godspeed. Hopefully it will be open in the spring.
Sounds lovely. Well, thank you very much again, and very nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.